The Road to Autonomy is presented by the Road to Autonomy Index. The Road to Autonomy Index is a rules-based equity benchmark index that measures the performance of a basket of global companies that are involved in the development and commercialization of autonomy. Institutional investors and fund managers are watching megatrends that are shaping investment opportunities today. These megatrends are creating thematic investment ideas and opportunities for forward-thinking investors. We believe that one of the biggest megatrends today is autonomy. That's why we created the Road to Autonomy Index, the world's first and only pure-play index to track the thematic investment opportunity in autonomy. Follow the Road to Autonomy Index on your favorite finance app by simply typing in the ticker Autonomy. To learn more about the Road to Autonomy Index, visit roadtoautonomy.com/index. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back Pete Bigelow, Senior Reporter Automotive News. Pete, welcome back as always, sir.
Thanks, Grayson. It's great to join you today. Appreciate the invite.
I love having you here, Pete. We're going to have that beer one of these days that we keep joking about. We see each other at conferences and out on the road. And what was it? At Self-Racing Cars, I think we had one in this Mexican restaurant. But I had to run to a plane. But we had one. We didn't have multiple. And everybody knows that I love multiple. But you have these really great insights into the mobility markets. And when we're, you can say, passing in the night or passing by at a conference, we're always sharing these fun little tidbits with one another. Before we get into autonomy, the EV market's been on the top of my mind. A lot of change in the market. You have Automotive News has been doing really great reporting on it. You had an article yesterday where 5,000 dealerships in the United States sent a second letter to President Biden urging him to hit the brakes on the EV push. And the interesting part of that you highlighted in your article and your colleagues did, all 50 states. This is not red versus blue. This is all 50 states. Pete, what's going on with the market?
I think the more detailed question, Grayson, is what's going on with certain automakers versus others. I think the EV market can't be lumped into a monolith. It's really how certain companies are approaching a change from early adopters to mass market consumers. And that's where we get into the nitty gritty of a potential slowdown.
Well, let's get some numbers to that. So I believe, this is my opinion, I've stated this on the record many times, and I'll state it on the record right now, there is no EV market. The EV market is Tesla and everybody else. They're falling by the wayside, and I'm going to give some numbers to that. In 2023, 1.2 million EVs were sold in the United States, and this is according to estimates from Kelley Blue Book, with 55% of those coming from Tesla. Okay? That's big. GM only sold 75,000 of those EVs. What's going on? This is clearly Tesla's market.
No doubt. I think Tesla is running away with the domestic market right now. Part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that, look, GM and Ford and Chrysler are making their profits on trucks and SUVs right now. And to their credit, they've introduced product that is electrified in those realms, but I don't necessarily know that it's competitive. And I don't know that pickup truck owners who want a lot of towing capacity kind of immediately see some of the limitations of having a battery electric vehicle. So you put that together and there's a bit of a disconnect.
There's a video that was going around TikTok today. There was the GMC Hummer was stuck in mud, and due to the weight, the guy couldn't get it out. And he tried to use his tractor to get it out, and he couldn't get it out. And he said, "I'm never buying this." And insert piece of which I won't say because we're a kids program here. You're having all these issues. There's the multiple viral YouTube videos around towing. The Ford F-150 Lightning is the most recalled vehicle currently right now. That's not good. Ford is slowly ramping down production. The market's collapsing right now for EVs. The market's not there. It's Tesla and everybody else. But yet we've got this very bright spot in the market, hybrids.
Is it collapsing? I don't think the market overall is collapsing because I think Tesla is running away. I think Hyundai and Kia have some very compelling products in the market. I just think the market is, again, it's not a monolith. It's bifurcated by segment. And the traditional companies that have historically done well in the SUV and pickup truck segments are finding that those segments may not be well suited for electrification, and thus they're ill-positioned.
Very valid points. Now, let's add some spicy ingredients into the mix here. What happens when BYD comes to America?
Grayson, I think what's really interesting and compelling there is as we've seen the likes of GM and Chrysler and Ford gravitate toward pickups and SUVs, they've inadvertently left the whole lower end of the market open. Those vehicles that I just mentioned are really expensive. There's an affordability question. And when BYD gets here with their $12,000 vehicle, and even when you add a 28.5% tariff to that, the whole entry level of the automotive industry is ripe to be taken by BYD and anyone else who wants to be here. It's a huge blind spot in Detroit, in my opinion.
How much of this is Detroit's fault for caving into what Sean Fain's demands were for the UAW? Detroit is not going to be able to compete on price.
Right now, I'm not going to say that it's the fault of the UAW and the way that the labor talks went, because that's all still to come, which makes this all the more daunting. But I don't think that's priced into the vehicle that's been on the lot the last 2 months as we've kind of started talking about the big uncertainty around this point in time in the electrification transition. But that's still to come in the years ahead. And that makes this all the more uphill of a climb for domestic automakers.
I mentioned the dealers earlier. They're irritated. Well, frankly, they're pissed off. If you look at the average EV spends 82 days on the lot. That's costing that dealer a lot of money. Are we at a tipping point where the dealers just flat out rebel and say, we don't want them, we can't make money, as this economy is uncertain if we are going to have a soft landing or a hard landing? We had numbers out of Louis Vuitton and Hennessy. They're up 13% today because they blew out earnings. We had earnings from American Express. The more affluent customers continue to spend. They're up over 2.28%. But yeah, on the other side, we had Visa as seeing a slowdown in spending because Visa goes across a wide variety of credit scores. They're a processor. We'll get MasterCards later this week. It seems to me that we're back to two markets, Pete. We're back to the affluent market that keeps spending, and then we're back to the Main Street market that's not spending and is drowning in credit card debt.
To your point, I think that's really interesting. There is that accumulation of debt that we've seen with consumers, and you start thinking about the kitchen table decisions that they're making about vehicles. That could be part of this, but I also think beyond the economics that, again, we're moving from an EV market for early adopters to one that's mainstream consumers. They're worried about how these vehicles perform in the cold. They're worried about charging reliability. The charging network is still very embryonic right now. And I hate to use a cliche, but building the airplane while you're trying to fly it kind of rings true right now.
It's sad. We were caught flat-footed. We fundamentally were not prepared for this transition. The only company that was prepared for Tesla because they built the supercharging network. That was one of the most sought-after strategic advantages that Tesla did. It turns out to be absolutely brilliant. And remember, this years ago, it got raked over the coals. Why are you doing this? But if you talk to consumers, a majority, I'm not going to give a percentage here, a majority of the public and consumers agree that the Tesla supercharger network is reliable. So Tesla's a brand. It's not an auto company. It's a brand. It has a halo effect. It has a very loyal, I'm going to use a crazy term with you, Wall Street bets like atmosphere around it where people absolutely adore it. If you want to use the term fanatic around the halo of the brand. There's another brand with not as a loyal following from a public perception standpoint, but a very loyal following, Apple. Apple's a brand. It's a very loyal following. I own a MacBook. You own a MacBook. Individuals around us own it. And then there was really interesting in Apple's Q3 2023 earnings call. The CFO made a statement there that didn't get a lot of attention picked up, but I want to point out to you here. It was interesting. The average Apple installed user base, which is over 2 billion individuals, spends 5 hours a day on their Apple devices. 5 hours a day. That's a lot of time spent between your MacBook, your iPhone, your Apple TV. Let's go, your iPad. Let's go down the line of devices that individuals own. So 5 hours a day, highlighted by the Apple CFO. Which brings me to this Bloomberg report that came out that Apple's getting ready to introduce an Apple car in 2028. They're dialing back from L4 to L2. If you're spending 5 hours a day on your Apple devices, I'm not a psychologist or a doctor, I'll paraphrase that, you're addicted. Does this pave the way for Apple to enter the EV market with an L2 system and start to scale just because of the addiction that individuals around the world have for their devices?
5 hours a day sounds like more time than my kids spend playing Minecraft. So that's a lot. Like that's a barometer right there. And that's the promise of the Apple car, right? That they're going to just capture your attention in just one more living space. So I think this does bring that one step closer. I'm a little skeptical of it because we've been hearing about it for so many years, and the Apple car saga has taken so many twists and turns. It's interesting, right? Like they're one of the companies that does hardware and software really well. It remains to be seen in the automotive context how they do the hardware portion of this. Like I have no doubt that the car experience will be second to none. And then in that sense, they probably do wind up competing with Tesla, but there's still a long road ahead. I believe the Apple Car L4, L2 plus, whatever, like when I see it.
I haven't seen it, but I have a very good friend who's seen the prototype vehicle. So it's real. I've not seen a photo. I've not seen the vehicle. I'll say that. So the Apple people don't show up and knock on my door. But I have a very good friend who has seen the prototype. So there is a prototype vehicle. It's not out there, but Apple has built a prototype vehicle. Let's say this is all hypothetical for the record. Apple hypothetically gets to deal with Magna or BMW or one of these large manufacturers, and they manufacture a really great automobile product. Apple does the interior, the UX, UI design. The vehicle works, let's say an L2 system on somewhere between your traditional L2 and what FSD is doing, and FSD, for the record, is still an L2 system. Does Apple become the biggest competitor to Tesla, potentially going forward, if they're able to crack that?
If they're able to crack that, I think potentially yes. Be interesting to see if Sony and Honda get their Afeela to the market in some way where they are a competitor and have something of a second mover advantage in kind of becoming that top tier competitor to Tesla. Grayson, I'm going to go off subject here just a little bit. The other thing that bothers me a little bit about the latest reports on the Apple Car is like this idea that they're downgrading from level 4 to level 2, or they're pulling back and they're not doing full autonomy. I think it's very important to remember that a vehicle that drives itself and has no role for a human driver is very different than one that is designed to support a human driver. Those are like fundamentally, strikingly different things. The whole levels of autonomy kind of enable this, like, oh, we're going up, we're going down, we're retreating notion. But like that all sounds like gobbledygook to me, because I think like these are different products, and to the idea that Apple will meet Tesla where it's at as Tesla tries to go toward more advanced levels of autonomy, that is interesting. And I do think that they are probably one of the companies that, again, in theory, the lot to be done, that could be best equipped to be that top tier challenger to Tesla, more than the traditional automakers right now, who are very much struggling to evolve in this software defined era.
You bring up a lot of very valid points. You look at traditional OEMs versus Apple. Traditional OEMs, for the most part, outside of the pickup trucks classification, because there's a lot of brand loyalty in the pickup truck segment of that. There's a lot of loyalty to the Apple brand. And then consumers know you'll get in the hypothetical Apple vehicle, it'll just work. They're just used to that from all their devices. And you bring up the levels. You're right to be skeptical around that. So the Bloomberg says, and this is quoting Bloomberg, it's quote unquote upgradable. Bull donkey dust. I don't see a world where Apple will build an L4 vehicle that's upgradable. I could see, let's just say hypothetically, in 2028, they introduce an electric vehicle with a driver assist system, a level 2 for highway driving. Okay, there's multiple companies today that have proven that hands-free highway driving is a viable option today for a personally owned vehicle. If you put driver monitoring in it, or to some degree where you do not have to touch the wheel. And then let's just fast forward into the future. I'm not going to give a timeline on this because I don't want to speculate on this. Fast forward to sometime in the future, I could see Apple introducing a new L4 vehicle that they put out as a service. And when they put it out as a service, I see Apple leveraging their Apple stores. There's an Apple store in 44 states. 44 states, and the Apple stores become a showroom. If you want to try the Vision Pro, you can go to certain select Apple stores, sign up, get your demo. They're well equipped for doing this. Introducing a vehicle into that environment at some point in the future is not that far off. What do you think of that?
What is not that far off? 2030? That would make sense with the time frame that was purported in the Bloomberg article, in some sense, that they're going to come in 2028 with the level 2 vehicle. Yes, leveraging that existing footprint that they have is something that could be a major advantage for Apple. No question. But again, I'll come back to like, there's a lot of devils in the details. And when Apple's closer to the market, I think we'll have a better idea of where they're going. But certainly, they're one of the few companies that has the capital in this high interest rate environment to make big bets that don't pay off for a decade. Let's call it that. Maybe it's shorter term, but maybe it's a decade. There's very few companies, I think, that can sustain that kind of investment. And like you look at the way Ford and Volkswagen parted ways with Argo is one example. Like even automakers can't do that anymore. So there's very few companies, an Apple, an Amazon, a Google, that can make those big term bets.
That's a great segue into the robotaxi market. To me, there is no robotaxi market. It's Waymo and everybody else. We had the incident with GM Cruise. The Quinn Emanuel report came out, the Cruise incident report. Not a lawyer when I say this, but that was bought and paid for by GM to protect the executives. There's no other way around that. There's no substance to it. It's just a giant overpaid insurance policy.
I think there is some substance to it. And I was up till 2 a.m. reading and writing about the Quinn Emanuel report last night. It does seem designed to shield executives. I would tend to agree with that. And I've heard that from sources that I've talked to in the last 12, 18 hours. And if you remember, Grayson, GM had an ignition switch problem and scandal about a decade ago. Maybe it's more than that at this point. And they produced a very similar third-party report called the Valukas report. And boy, if you go back and compare these two things, the parallels are striking. And the Valukas report essentially found that senior executives had no knowledge or idea that there were problems, and it essentially laid the blame at a bunch of mid-level managers, senior-level managers. That seems to be what I read from the Quinn Emanuel report now, that it was this computer glitch and their government affairs team that is receiving the brunt of the blame in this report.
It's sad because the men and women named in that report, a majority of them are personal friends, and they're being thrown under the bus for taking orders from GM. So I think if you want to do a real report, independent report, you got to start asking a lot of real hard questions inside of GM. Having a lot of friends at Cruise that are no longer there, they were not an independent company. Orders were coming from GM. Where does that line of communication come from? Where's the internal GM slacks? Where's all the internal GM communication? What did GM know? When did they know? What advice did they do? What crisis training did GM give them? What incident response training did GM give them? They're a very large publicly traded company. There are SWAT teams inside there that deal with this and scenario playing all the time. What's that? What's there?
Well, even if you step back prior to this crash that has certainly jeopardized the future of Cruise, I think one of the key questions that we still don't know the answer to is, what was the relationship of the Cruise board with GM and vice versa? Who was putting pressure on who to deploy as early as June 2022 when there was a whistleblower saying, time out, we can't start this commercial service because we have problems. So that's all like still unknown, essentially, in a public realm, is who was pressuring who.
That's a valid point because, okay, so let's go back to economics here. Let's look at GM stock since Mary Barr has become CEO. It has underperformed the S&P 500. Investors were better off buying VOO, SPY, any S&P index tracker that's going to track it. Outhandedly outperformed GM. The electric vehicle strategy is struggling. The bright drop bet didn't work. It was Travis Katz was not fully integrated into GM. They were betting the future on autonomy. I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Jacobson, the CFO of GM, at an investor conference last year. Mr. Jacobson was very, very bullish on it. Where does GM go from here? Because the S&P is the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. You have to think that, like Bright Drop, like many other initiatives, perhaps Cruise gets eventually either sold off for pennies on the dollar at this point, or they bring it into GM proper and it dies some sort of slow death and or contributes to Super Cruise, Ultra Cruise, and their automated driving programs. But I think the big question, Grayson, is like, look, Cruise was valued at $30 billion a year or two ago. And to your point about the GM stock price, what happens when, I think this to some extent already happened, but that was a big part of GM's overall valuation. And what happens now? It's not like Ford and Volkswagen, who they put $1 billion or $2 billion into Argo and they could walk away. This seems much more centrally tied to GM proper and GM's stock price.
If I'm a GM investor, which I'm not, but I will disclose GM as an index component of the Road to Autonomy Index, is where does GM go from here? I have a lot of questions. I don't know where their strategy is going to go. In my opinion, their autonomy cruise is over. They're never going to be able to compete and ramp up a commercial service. I don't see any which way forward it's going to go.
Do you think that's based because of the aftermath and fallout from this incident, or because they've already been behind in some way technologically, optically, et cetera?
The public. The brand's tarnished. This brand has been dragged through the mud. every which way from the sun. And you and I talked about this when you were on, I think 2 years ago or a year ago, about user experience and brands. And I'm going to go down that road for a little bit. You ride in the Waymo Jaguar I-Pace. It is a magical experience. There's no dividing glass. You have room in the back seat. You can fit comfortably. You can put an individual in the front seat. The ride is very smooth. I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago riding around in the Waymo vehicle, and it was that typical San Francisco fog and rain. And it was just preloaded. And so whoever on the Waymo team did this, high five, brilliant to you. They had Miles Davis kind of blue. And I'm setting out these long journeys, sitting here, about 45-minute journey, just good to go nowhere, just to experience it. Driving through the fog in the rain, San Francisco, listening to Kind of Blue in this smooth drive, in this beautiful, luxurious experience. Magic. Compare that to when I was in the cruise vehicles, both in San Francisco and in Austin, Texas. It was interesting. When I was there, we were busting Black Dog Out by Zeppelin in there. But it was very tight. The passenger experience was not the same. You just don't have the trust, and you don't have the passenger experience.
I've had largely positive experiences in both Waymo and Cruise vehicles. The thing that stands out to me just from sitting in the backseat of a Cruise Bolt robotaxi was I couldn't mess with the temperature. It was like blasting hot at me the last time. There was no way to turn the temperature down, or if there was, I couldn't find it. But to this point, do you think, had they gotten to the point where the Origin was deployed, would that have significantly changed the consumer experience?
It could have. I don't know if this is public or not, but I'm about to make it public. The original plan for the Origin, as you know, was to be a shared vehicle. So let's just say you and I are in San Francisco and we're going to have dinner at an oyster bar, for example. Got to do it. You're in San Francisco. We'll go to an oyster bar for dinner. We're going to have our beer. And we get there and then we have to pick somebody up along the way.
Which is a very risky plan, but we'll come back to that. I don't want to interrupt your thought too much here.
No, we'll get back to that. So you have to take individuals, pick up individuals. All the data that they started to gather as it got closer and closer to it, the consumer rebelled. This is post-COVID, did not want it. And they were going to announce that it could be single rider in the Origin. It was not going to have to be shared. You know who else got that same data? Zoox. Zoox is not going to have to be shared anymore. The days of the shared vision is going away. Would riding in the Origin be a great experience? Yeah, probably a great experience. You and I would have fun. But does it make sense if it's not going to be shared?
Well, I imagine that consumers would have to pay more for their ride, but this gets back to exactly what I was thinking, Grayson. You remember when Ford tried Chariot? We know that 78% of consumers drive their own cars by themselves to work when they're commuting to and from work. Americans have not adopted a mindset that they're willing to share their rides, and I don't see why anyone ever thought that that needle would substantially change.
This is where I get in a lot of trouble. It comes down to politics. There's certain individuals in the executive suites of these companies that say shared, shared, shared because they have a European view on politics. Americans have a red, white, and blue view on politics. And if you look at the history of mobility, you just look at the politics of this country, Americans don't want to share. They want their own vehicle. That's why cars sell. They want their own vehicle. But yet somebody had the idea to make it shared, and it turns out to be a waste of shareholder dollars.
I think if I was going to take the vantage point that vehicles are going to be shared and that's going to be a success, I think it's because you drive down the cost per rider to such a low level compared to my own vehicle that it becomes something I'm willing to do. The European view, in a lot of cases, particularly in this context of trying to reduce our emissions and global warming, is not wrong. Most people are driving, one person in a 5-seat vehicle that they drive for 6% of the time and park the rest of the time. They're eating up valuable space to park them in cities, and they're consuming a lot of resources, spewing a lot of carbon, all while we move ourselves. And it's not very efficient to move my 180-pound body with a 4,000-pound machine that barely gets used. I think there's a lot of valid arguments as to why we need to move toward shared transportation, mass transportation. And I'll tell you, one of the silliest things I saw at CES was the loop. Like, why do we have all these Teslas going through this tunnel when some sort of trolley or anything that move people in greater numbers than 4 at a time that are being driven by a human driver still? That was one of the more inefficient ways that kind of brought all the points that I just made home, was riding through the loop underneath the convention center at CES.
I went in the loop, and they're not supposed to talk to you, but I got one of the drivers to talk to me. And I said, why are we not on autopilot? Why are you here? Why are we not running FSD? Union rules. Must have a driver. Okay. So that answers that, and I'm not going to get into that hot potato there, but that pretty much answers that. Yes. Do you make a lot of valid points around why we should share? Yes. Is there something going on with the environment and the climate? Yes. There's no doubt about that. But consumers aren't going to change. They want their privacy and they want their freedom. So why not just invent a better product? That's why the best-selling class of vehicle, consumers want a big vehicle, is SUV. Consumers love SUVs. Suburban moms love SUVs. And we know what suburban moms are? They're one of the most influential voting blocks. They swing elections. If Trump is going to get the Republican nomination, if he loses suburban moms, he loses the White House. That's how important suburban moms are to this country, and they love SUVs.
Can they be incentivized, I guess, is a big picture across transportation. Any of these modes or ways we look at this, can they be incentivized to change that? I don't know. Perhaps I think they can be incentivized to choose electric vehicles, but suburbanites in general, the infrastructure of our country is not set up to share rides.
No, you said it right. The infrastructure is not set up to share rides. You're correct. So why not continue to back Waymo, which is they're all electric, they're reducing emissions, a beautiful robo-taxi to an increased ODD. And based on the filings with the California Public Utilities Commission, Waymo is expanding in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're expanding in LA. Way to go for going down there. And you combine that ODD along with the Chandler Phoenix ODD, and I'm going to highlight something. Waymo GA team, you had a spelling error in your California Public Utilities Commission paper. You spelled Scottsdale wrong. You might want to use spell check next time. They're taking that to 635 square miles of an ODD. That's the largest deployment of an ODD anywhere in the world. And you're going to bring on Austin and then Miami.
It's shocking when you look at the geography that they intend to expand over. We're not talking about adding another neighborhood, not talking about just propping up the first makings of service in LA. The geography is stunning. They're going to expand and cover the entire San Francisco peninsula. They're going to cover just about all of LA. I kind of feel like after the cruise nadir of robotaxi sentiment, all of a sudden, boy, you take a look at where Waymo intends to expand, factor in the fact that they have been driverlessly and commercially in Phoenix for years. This feels like it could be the breakthrough moment.
It could be the breakthrough moment, and I will publicly predict by the end of 24, maybe give me the first week of 25 in this, Waymo's ODD will be larger than 1,000 square miles. ODD expands. Now you're going to go into more suburban areas. They're going into Pacific Palisades. They're going into Beverly Hills. Mayor Mirish, sir, we made it happen. We got the autonomous vehicles to Beverly Hills. Now you can start to make the honest pitch of, hey, you don't need a second car. You have a Waymo vehicle to go wherever you want. If you can even just reduce households by one vehicle every day in Los Angeles, that's a game changer. That's a real big game changer.
Yes. I wonder if LA is a unique market in the sense that it's so spread out and suburban versus could Waymo take a similar service and have enough rider density in the suburbs around the more typical city that has a general center area that they can kind of get out on the far reaches and provide suburban service? Or is it really more of an urban thing and LA is this very spread out urban area? I don't know.
Two markets come to mind. Atlanta, you have the Buckhead neighborhood, which is very spread out and going into the suburbs of North Atlanta. Then you got Miami, which I'm championing. So you have the downtown Brickell concentration area, which is Wall Street South that Mr. Griffin's building down there. Then you can go into Coral Gables. You can go to Miami Beach. You can go to Key Biscayne. There's so many areas within Miami. So you have it's very similar to LA in the way it's designed with the suburban, urban all put together. That's a very positive ODD. And Miami has horrible traffic.
What I really want in Miami, Grayson, is to take my eVTOL aircraft from MIA when I land and get out to Key Biscayne or down in the Keys somewhere. But I guess there's different tiers where we may see new mobility options come to your fair city there.
You want to go to the Keys, that's fine and dandy. I'm going to use the Walt Disney term. I want to plus this. I want to go to the Bahamas. Right now, I could charter a Cessna plane, turboprop, and I can make it to the Bahamas in 42 minutes. So an eVTOL, I should be able to make that in 35 minutes, 36 minutes. Think about the positive economic impact in the Bahamas, despite what's reported around Nassau with all the glitz and glamour. The Bahamas is a very poor country. Think about the positive economic impact that we could have on their tourism economy by bringing more individuals there in a clean, sustainable manner.
Boy, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. I don't know. What is the FAA's perspective going to be on over water operations for an eVTOL aircraft to an international market? I think you just increase the complexity of what already is a very arduous certification process and limitations of the technology to have the right batteries on board, to have the requisite backup time to get to the alternate airport. It's interesting. And in theory, it makes sense that you could cut that trip that much shorter. But I think that's a rabbit hole that fuel will go down, at least in the early going.
It's funny you say that because I pitched that to Lilium and very similar to what you said. But does that open the door for Regent? They're basically sea gliders. The sea glider can land on the ocean. You better hope you don't sink because, as my daughter would say, you got big chompers there. You got big sharks with big teeth. So you got to be careful there. But in theory, does that open the door for Regent?
Yeah, I think Regent, Navier, all these electric boat companies that are essentially aircraft atop the water. Again, we're in the very early innings, but when you think about use cases in transportation and how they could fill a weight space right now, yes, I think the doors are wide open for that. Look around the Bay Area, going from San Francisco to Oakland or around Seattle or Manhattan. It's an near endless list. We haven't even talked globally, but I do think there's new, potentially cost-effective markets that open with these new watercraft.
There's definitely markets there, and Lilium's working on going Miami to Tampa, Miami to West Palm. I want to go globally. I sat through an investor pitch on an eVTOL company. I sat through a lot of pitches. And they want to run from the Charles de Gaulle Airport, CDG, in Paris to downtown Paris. And if you've spent a significant amount of time in Paris, you know one thing. Actually, no, two things. It's an incredibly beautiful city. I love Paris, for the record. Two, the traffic is absolutely horrendous. So I'm sitting through this investor pitch and hearing this thing, and they want to run an eVTOL from the airport to downtown. Well, how many passengers can you take? One passenger. Okay, it's not good. Well, pitch is already off to a bad start. How much luggage can you take? We can't take luggage. We send your luggage in a car. So I said to the CEO, I said, you mean to tell me you want me to invest in a company and take one passenger and no luggage so I can skip the traffic? Yeah. I said, no, thank you. I'll sit in traffic. I'm not going to leave my family behind. When does the business sense in some of these things? I got to give Lilium credit. Lilium's got to deal with NetJets, and they're going to the luxury market, to the high-end consumer. And they had this other company, which remained anonymous, but you put two and two together, you can figure out who it is. And they want to launch for the Olympics. Back and forth, one person in the Olympics. You're going to have luggage. It's not going to happen.
I mean, the whole eVTOL market, there's certainly a school of thought out there that says that this is all the latest vaporware in transportation, and we're just going to catch up with it in a few years like we did everything else. But certainly the idea that tens of thousands of these are going to launch, I think, is probably rosy. But in a lot of ways, the problems are different than the ones that we have talked about on ground transportation. In some ways, electrification, battery energy density, like some of them are the same problems. But I'm going to go back to what we said too. You talked about how traffic in Paris and Miami is horrendous. In LA, it's horrendous. So for the masses, if we're going to change that, how do we get back to the idea of some sort of shared transportation? And maybe that's not a 6-passenger vehicle or a 4-passenger Origin, whatever. Like, when do we take a serious look at public transit and how that needs to evolve from the terrible experience that it largely is today?
You don't. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. You don't. It's just a complete waste of taxpayer dollars. Look at the data from MTA, the amount of money that they're wasting.
So we're just going to subsidize roads and traffic and all sit in congestion for perpetuity?
You want the honest, blunt answer? Yes. I don't see any other way that this is going to change. Yes, you're going to have congestion pricing, but we saw in New York, there's a lawsuit going on to stop the congestion pricing because it affects those that are most economically challenged. And New York's probably going to lose the lawsuit, and the congestion pricing and going into Manhattan is probably going to go away. And then that's going to set a precedence. So yes, the dream of shared transportation, the dream of public transportation, it's a myth. Just like the boogeyman, it's a myth.
Well, it's not, because if you go to Europe, Grayson, you go to Germany and you take trains anywhere you want to go most times a day. It's the easiest thing in the world to get around without a car. I'm not trying to reveal myself as one with that European mindset that we referenced earlier, but sometimes it's so easy to go there. And it's like, why can't we have nice things here? Why can't I get around the Bay Area in a much more efficient manner? I'll leave my little corner of Southeast Michigan here is probably hopeless in that sense. But I think there are areas where public transit that's more reliable and a better consumer experience, to bring it back to that, could and should be viable. And considering we're subsidizing roads so much, why not take the losses just as well on the public transit side of things?
It's a cultural mindset. There's no other way for me to describe it to you but a cultural mindset. Yes, what you described, it works brilliantly in Europe, certain parts of Europe, not all parts of Europe, but certain parts of Europe. Amsterdam, for example, has a really great train system to go from the airport to downtown. It's the cultural mindset. So I don't see that European mindset coming to America in my lifetime. I could be wrong, but I'm not betting on it. I'm not investing in it. And I'm not looking at it.
Just for the record, I would not bet on it coming here anytime soon either.
See, your mindset's the right mindset. See, I love you. That's why we love having you on here, because you've got the right mindset. So I read a lot. You read a lot. You do really great reporting along with your colleagues at Automotive News. I'm going to talk about an outlet here. It's not Automotive News, but it was really interesting. CBS News. They have their political report. I read this really interesting report today on CBS News. They had a political report out of New Hampshire. And this individual was just polling individuals around the economy, President Biden, just trying to get a feel from voters after the Republican nomination just went through New Hampshire, along with the write-in ballots for President Biden. Overwhelmingly, 82% not happy about the economy because their grocery bills were so high. And this reporter, and it was on video, and so you can watch it. I'll actually send it to you, Pete. Some of his reactions about the grocery bills. So I've been having this theory for a long time, and I think you and I have talked about this offline, around the autonomous trucking industry. So you sit here, you have 82% of these individuals at CBS News interview coming out of this grocery store pissed off because of the amount of money they're spending. What if the autonomous trucking industry got together and everything in that store was 25% off because of the efficiencies of autonomy? Does that change the narrative on this technology as the unions get very, very hostile on it? Because the American public's clearly saying we're suffering at the grocery store.
It's a rather brilliant conundrum you raise, Grayson, because I think that the UAW and labor is pushing hard against autonomous trucking. There's a couple regulatory requirements those hoops still need to be jumped through before the likes of Kodiak and Aurora fulfill their plans to launch commercial service by the end of this year. But we have an election in November. So I think all these factors that you just laid out, groceries are a pain point for middle-class consumers. Autonomy is one thing that over the long term, that's not going to make a difference here in 2024, but certainly could play a role in reducing those prices. Yet we are seeing that resistance from organized labor to autonomous trucks. So it's a bit of a pick your poison solution here, especially on the Democratic side of the ledger. I don't think you're going to see anything happen until December, but I think you will see things happen in December after the election that perhaps happen in such rapid fashion that we see Aurora and Kodiak launched by the end of 2024 as they plan.
If you look at the union influence, they're running bills to effectively ban autonomous vehicles and trucks in New York, Indiana, South Dakota, California. The list goes on. Kodiak, Aurora, both very publicly stated public statements that they're going to go out, driver out in 24. Because I believe they're going to do it. So I'm going to do this. When they go out, driver out in 24, does Kodiak and Aurora become the de facto leaders in autonomous trucking just because of the strides that they're making?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a bit different when you look at the driver assists companies on the trucking side versus passenger, because if you can start using autonomy to get around hours of service, you have game changers. That's when I really think you see immediate commercial business benefits to full self-driving trucks. Are Aurora and Kodiak the de facto leaders? Probably. Gatik is another interesting one, but they're not doing long-haul routes. But I think they're important to mention in the self-driving truck conversation, essentially for the same reasons. They'd be right up in that leadership group, no question. I do think that once it happens on the trucking side, it's going to happen fast.
You're right about Gatik. I talked to a very large investor that's managing multi-billion dollars of capital. And we were talking about Gatik. And this investor said to me, why has nobody competed with them? They have such a profitable niche with a use case that's just going to continue as more DCs come on the line. More, you have to get it now. You have to get it now, or they're going to have to keep moving stuff. Why has nobody really stepped in to compete with Gatik, in your opinion?
I don't know. It's a great question. I think early on, so many people were focused on the long haul side of things that you had to essentially amortize whatever human cost you had in operations over more miles. So long haul looked appealing in that sense. But I think Gaddic's business model is a bit different, where they're not charging customers per mile, they're charging them per truck on an annual basis. And that's the secret sauce, I think, that best answers the question.
And their contracts, I've heard, are multi-year contracts. So they're generating significant amounts of revenue from what I'm hearing in the investment circles.
I believe that it's multi-year. I'd have to look back on that to be sure. And I don't know how much they're charging per truck, but I believe that's right. I believe that they have selected partners here in this early going that are with them for the long term. So that would speak to multi-year efforts and probably multi-year contracts.
What happens to everybody else in trucking? There's Torque with Daimler, there's Wabi, there's the new emergence of Stack, and then there's Plus. What happens there?
Plus is an interesting one because I do think that there's a lot of merit in the tack that they've taken to the market, which is starting with driver assist systems and gradually building toward full self-driving. One of the big shifts we've seen over the last few years is in 2021, you could go to the VC community and raise whatever kind of money you wanted for any of these ventures. And now here in 2024, you better be making revenue today or have a very clear path to revenue in the short term. And I think that's where Plus has succeeded in that they've got a product, a driver assist product that's in the market today. That is both a financial bridge and a technical one toward a future that includes greater levels of autonomy.
There's the rumor going around the Plus was in Green Bay a couple days ago, and they've got the Navistar deal. But why would Navistar want to go back in this after the debacle they had with Too Simple around the origins of the company? You could say there are questions around the origins. Plus, they've been reported in multiple outlets. Is Navistar making another mistake?
No, I think last year Plus answered any questions it had about what was going to China or not with a clear separate company. There are two separate companies now. I asked them about this within the last few months. There's no technology that's being shared. They're, for all intents and purposes, two separate deals. So I think something like that probably sets the stage for a deal with a company like Navistar. And Navistar burned once, but does that mean that they just sit out the game forever? That's equally risky.
They can't afford to it. And then here's the other thing that's starting to bubble up and brew under the surface. Rumblings are picking up. Waymo's interviewing for Waymo Via. They're going to kickstart the program again. Word on the street is they take delivery of the Cascadia with dual redundancy autonomous platforms in June, July. What happens if and when Waymo comes back? And I am going to paraphrase this with public data. Every partnership outside of C.H. Robinson that Waymo has publicly announced throughout the history of Waymo Via, the talking point is, quote unquote, partnership is on hold, end quote. You're not using that term if it's done. Using that term if something may possibly happen, and I'm hearing that something might be happening.
That's very interesting. I would say that you're breaking news here on the Road to Autonomy podcast, and I better get writing as soon as we're done if Waymo is on the comeback trail. That's interesting because Waymo and Aurora had this idea, and they came at it from separate sides of the spectrum, that they're going to build a driver that's versatile enough to go from a robo-taxi to a Class 8 truck or vice versa. And I think, at least at this point in time here in January 2024, I would say that for lots of reasons that has failed or not come to fruition. But if you're saying that the development costs are still viewed as something small enough where they would bring it back soon, and I think there were a lot of learnings that went from trucks to robotaxis for Waymo in particular. You look at, they're now doing highways in Phoenix. That came from the trucking side of the operation. So there's probably good reasons to have both going. But what I'm saying is, like, if that's a failure or an incomplete here in January 2024, let's remember that we're looking at a very narrow, this is just a snapshot in time. Like, that might be wrong to your report here that things might change by the summer.
We all know the market's going to continue to change. I think the change is really healthy in it. Looking at the autonomy markets, and what are you most excited about this year? Is there something that are you looking for a major breakthrough, a major acquisition? What are you looking for?
Boy, I think we have not talked about Mobileye in China yet. That's one point. We did talk about the geography that Waymo is expanding to, and LA and San Francisco and ostensibly elsewhere. Totally agree with your projection that by the end of the year, they're up to 1,000 square miles. That's something to be excited about. So there are things to be excited about in autonomy, right? It's not the trough of disillusionment. It's who's coming through the other side. And we are seeing some drips and drabs that all is not lost at the very least.
I'll say this point blank. The autonomy market is healthy. The autonomy market is investable. It's coming. It's going to usher in the autonomy economy. Pete, over the years, you and I, we're going to continue to have these conversations. You're going to continue to do really great reporting in automotive news of what you're seeing here from your seat in Detroit. And we're going to have you back on because Mobileye is a whole hour conversation into itself. And we got Evercore, we got your research, Bank of America, we've got your research, JPM, I got your research too. So we're going to do a whole episode, Pete, you and I just on Mobileye, and we're going to break it down. They're a Road to Autonomy Index component company. I want to break it down with you. But for today, Pete, as we look to wrap up our insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I guess an observation I had a month ago, I think it was a day or two before Christmas, and Hyperloop One announced it was shuttering its operations. The same day, Bird scooter company announced that they were filing for bankruptcy. Cruise stuff was kind of hanging over. I thought, boy, like we're just not going to get out of the status quo. I really had this idea coalesce in my mind that nothing's really changing in transportation. Then I went to CES. Then I heard about what BYD's sales numbers were in 2023. Grayson, I guess if there's a takeaway, it's the more years that I do this, the less I know. That's the takeaway.
I like that. That just says the industry is growing. It's a global industry. It's not just the United States industry. It is a global industry. And we'll continue to cover it here on the Road to Autonomy. We'll continue to have Pete Bigelow back. And you're coming back for the Mobileye episode. We'll schedule it offline. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is a healthy and growing autonomous vehicle and truck market. Pete, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks for having me, Grayson. Fun conversation.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices LLC to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.